Welcome to the next installment in our lecture series here at Rutgers University for the American Economic History course online. And in this chapter, what we're going to take a look at, and in this lecture series, what we're going to take a look at is slavery, and in particular taking a look at the economic aspects of slavery. So there's a couple of things that I think will be important for you to understand when we do this. Number one, you will see here we are talking, excuse me, the research of CONRAD and MEYER. And what is going to be important about this research is that it really overturned much of the prevailing wisdom that existed about economics of slavery, of the plantation system in the South. So what I want you to understand is, number one, have an understanding of what people thought about slavery from an economic perspective prior to the research of CONRAD and MEYER, and how their research changed that prevailing thought. Also, we'll take a look at the research of FOGEL and ENGERMAN, very important figures in economic history. I believe that they recently won Nobel Prizes in economics for their work on the economics of slavery. They have a book called Time on the Cross, and they came up with 10 major conclusions about slavery. Some of them are not too novel; they just underpin the research of CONRAD and MEYER. But they also have some controversial assertions. So we'll go over all those findings of FOGEL and ENGERMAN and go over the more controversial aspects of their research. Then we'll take a look at the research of STECKEL, particularly how his approach differed from other people's approaches. In particular, STECKEL was taking a look at the treatment or the material existence of slaves, and his approach is very different from the approaches that other people looked at in determining how well the slaves were treated. And it's to me, it's very interesting work how he approached these issues. And then finally, we'll take a look at the work of ELKINS and GENOVESE. ELKINS takes a look at, it's more of a sociological aspect, but we'll look at what ELKINS talks about. And then we'll talk about GENOVESE and his explanation as to why there were very few slave revolts in the United States, and while in the Caribbean there were quite a few, and his explanation as to the differences between the two regions that led to the differences in the occurrences of slave revolts. Now, as a historical backdrop, you have to realize, number one, it's a difficult subject to talk about slavery, number one. It's a very important thing to talk about in the history of the United States and the economic history of the United States. Very important. But you have to realize that in the context of this course, we are taking a look at the economics of slavery. Therefore, we are taking the view of an economist. An economist does not look at things through that moral prism. All right, we are not discussing whether or not slavery was moral or immoral, or the individuals who engaged in it, what type of people that they were. As an economist, we look at the situation and say slavery existed as an institution in the South. It was legal to do so. Therefore, we are not making any moral judgments about slavery. All right. Obviously, as a humanist, the notion of owning another person is repugnant. I can't imagine being in a situation where I mind being owned. I have a great deal of difficulty being told what to do, let alone being owned by somebody else. So realize that we're taking it from that perspective, and the difficulty of that perspective is you're taking a look at it in a dispassionate view. In essence, we are looking at people being treated the same way as cattle or livestock. But that's how it was viewed in that time period. So we have to go from that, the analysis, the economic analysis of the institution, from that perspective. Also realize that a little bit of the differences between indentured servitude and slavery. All right, when we talked about indentured servitude previously, an individual signed away future labor in exchange for passage to the New World. But remember, an indentured servant, most indentured servants, engaged in this contract freely. They signed off on that contract. Now, there are some individuals who didn't. For example, Great Britain was known for when they decided they wanted to clear out the prisons, that they would force individuals into indentured servitude just to get them out of the prison system. Basically getting them out of their hair. So when I say free labor, I include indentured servitude in there because the individuals, or most individuals in an indentured contract, freely sign that contract. The slave had no freedom. They didn't sign themselves up for slavery. They were just taken into slavery. Also, with indentured servitude versus slavery, remember the difference also that the contract is finite with an indentured servant. Also, the fact that children of indentured servants don't automatically become indentured servants. So I want you to be aware of those fundamental differences between an indentured servant and a slave. Also, with slavery, make sure you understand the importance of slavery as a labor input in cotton production. Very much tied together. There are several books. I believe there's one book called The Cotton Economy of the South. I'm not sure if that title is exactly correct. If you're interested in this topic, it's by Gavin Wright. I've read this book. It's a very, very good economic history book. He goes through explaining basically how cotton agriculture and slavery were tied together. It's a very, very good book. Well, it's a very good read for an economic history book. It's not a page turner like a murder mystery or etc. But if you're interested in economic history, in particular how cotton and slavery were tied together in the South, it's a good book to read through. So realize that slavery was very much tied to the cotton industry, the cotton growing industry in the South. And when we go and look through these things from the perspective of an economist, we are going to be looking for cause and effect relationships. For example, when we talk about slavery and cotton, slavery was used with other forms of agriculture, but it was not to the degree that cotton was. So we look for cause and effect relationships, particularly as it relates to the use of slave labor. For example, when we looked at previously, we saw that there were very few people, very few slaves relative to a free population in New England. So we're looking for cause and effect relationships to explain, well, why was there so few slaves relative to free people in New England? And in South Carolina, for example, 60% of the population was a slave population. So we're trying to look for cause and effect relationships to help explain the regional differences in the utilization of slavery. And also, we're going to compare the slave labor system, plantation labor system to other forms of labor. All right, so we will compare it to indentured servitude and to free labor. I want you to realize that there are limitations to that. That, for example, comparing a slave labor force to a free labor force, that's one comparison that we can make, but realize that the shortcoming of that is that one is a slave labor force and one is a free labor force. For example, a free worker, if they do not like the type of work, they don't have to do it. They can quit their job and go work somewhere else or move to another area of the country or move to another country completely. A slave does not have that level of freedom. So I want you to realize that we are going to make some comparisons between other labor systems, but you have to realize that inherently there is a flaw with comparing slavery to other systems, other labor systems. The fact that you don't have freedom of choice as a slave, while that is available to a free worker, is a fundamental flaw, and it's one of the issues that we'll talk about with FOGEL and ENGERMAN. Sometimes people compare, for example, the material condition of slaves to the poorest people in the North. Well, they're still free individuals, and there's quite a distinction between being a slave and being a free individual. So what was the prevailing economic thought about the economic viability of slavery prior to the Civil War? Leading up until the 1950s, the prevailing thought was basically that slavery was doomed, that slavery was dying under the weight of its own inefficiencies, that if the Civil War had not occurred, slavery would have died out on its own in the United States because it was not economically viable. So make sure you understand that prevailing thought, that in essence the plantation system was not profitable, that individuals who were involved in the plantation system in the South were losing money because they were using slave labor. Now, realize that this was the prevailing thought for many years, leading up until about the 1950s. When we talk about CONRAD and MEYER's research, they sort of toppled that whole notion that slavery was doomed. All right? So make sure you realize that that was the prevailing wisdom, that it wasn't viable prior to the Civil War, that if the Civil War had not occurred, that slavery would have died out under its own weight, its own inefficiency, and that it was not profitable. And the argument that most people were using to explain why slavery was dying out on its own was that the cost of slaves was increasing over time. So the argument was that if you take a look at a time series of the value, for example, of a prime-aged male slave worker, a field hand during that time period, that there was a consistent inflationary trend for the cost of a slave. If you wanted to buy a male, let's say of prime age, somewhere between the ages of 18 and 25, the price of that hand, that individual, that slave, was increasing over time. And the argument was that this is the main input for the slave labor system, that this increasing price and the increasing cost associated with slaves would have undermined was undermining the profitability of the plantation labor system, and as this price increase continued upward, that this would have undermined the profitability. Also, the fact that investments in other opportunities were better. That the assumption was that as these prices of these slaves were going up, the profitability of slavery would have, of the plantation labor system in the South, would have decreased. Therefore, that individuals in the South would have stopped investing in slaves, buying slaves, and purchased other investments that would have given a greater rate of return. So what we would have seen would have been a substitution of investments. Instead of investing money in purchasing more slaves, the plantation owners would have invested in bonds or stocks or any other investment. That basically the assertion was that with the increase in the cost of slaves, the profit margins of plantation agriculture were declining and other investment opportunities were increasing in value. Therefore, people would have substituted away and purchased fewer slaves and purchased other investments that provided a greater rate of return on their investment. And that's the thoughts of Sidner and Phillips. They were the two main proponents of the fact that slavery was doomed, it was dying under its own weight, that as prices of slaves were going up, the plantation labor system was becoming less and less viable over time. All right. There was also the thought that slavery was an anachronism, that it was dying out, that it was an ancient proposition that was dying out. And it was also a pre-capitalist holdover. All right, and this is particularly being discussed by Karl Marx during the time period that slavery was dying out because it was, as capitalism was taking over, it was a pre-capitalistic system, and as capitalism became more and more entrenched, that slavery would have eventually died out. All right. And that the reason why it lasted so long in the South, that there was very little industry in the South. So it lasted longer in the South because it was still a much more agricultural base. But as the Industrial Revolution continued and we saw increasing levels of industry, there would have been increasing levels of industrialization in the South, which would have put further pressure on slavery in the South. So basically, that was the prevailing economic thought. That number one, there's also this notion that the slave system was inevitable in Southern agriculture, that it wasn't the choice of individuals, which is something I want you to make sure that you're aware of. It's almost as if they're, copying out for an excuse for the adoption. That there was no other system that could have been put in place in the South, therefore that the plantation agriculture system, the slave agriculture system in the South, it was inevitable. It wasn't due to conscious choices by individuals who were seeking to maximize profits given the constraints that they faced in other labor systems that could have been used. All right. So there's a bit of disagreement about that whole issue. I want you to be aware of that was part of the argument that some people argued that it wasn't a choice of the plantation owners. It was inevitable that they had to adopt slave labor and the plantation agriculture system in the South. And this particularly comes from the statements of plantation owners, which really runs contrary to what most economists think. Actually, many of the plantation owners, the larger plantation owners, actually were arguing that they were making less money by using the slave agriculture system, that they were deliberately losing profits in order to maintain the slave labor system, which, if you're working in a capitalistic system, I don't know very many people who deliberately go out to make less money or to lose money by keeping a particular slave system in place. That their argument was that they were doing this as a form of social control, that they were providing value to society by keeping slaves as slaves, because it would have been too costly to free them. There would have been all kinds of societal problems associated with doing that. So believe it or not, their argument was that we are deliberately taking lower levels of profit in order to maintain the slave system. They also made the argument, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense, because if you could make more money by just freeing the slaves and then paying them a prevailing wage rate, I don't understand why you would actually do that, but the plantation owners of the time period were arguing they were doing this as a form of social control, that they were imposing these additional costs on themselves of keeping a slave system in place that was losing money to benefit society as a whole. Not a very convincing argument, if you ask me. So just realize how important slavery was to the different regions. I told you previously that the slaves in the New England and Middle States weren't very important. If you take a look at this graph here, I got this from census data from, I believe, 1860. I have to double check on my notes. So you could go online and actually get these numbers. What you can see is one definitely is relative to the South. New England and the Middle States, just in comparison to the number of slaves, it's ridiculously small in New England and the Middle States. Actually, it kind of undermines this graph, because technically, if you wanted to look at the total balance of slaves in the United States, you could, in essence, just use the figures from the South. But you can see how important and how growing in importance slavery and slave agriculture and slave labor is to the South. It's a consistent upward trend in the South. We see this from 1788 going all the way up to 1830. From 1830 to 1840, there's a period of stagnation where it remains relatively flat. And then from 1840 up until 1862, we see that upward trend continuing. I'm going to double check. I remember specifically that I believe 1832 there was a very severe depression that hit the United States in 18. There was a panic, I believe, of 1832, which, if we talk about a panic of 1832, and if there's a long depression associated with that, with a decrease in economic activity, you would see that this would sort of flatten out. And then once the economy started to pick up, the demand for slaves would go up also. So realize that you can see that it's continually growing in importance in the South. And what do you see from the other regions? It's declining in importance in the Middle and the New England states. So just make sure you realize that relative to New England and the Middle States, that the South, its slave agriculture and slave labor is much more important. And over the time period of after the Revolutionary War, leading up to the Civil War, it was gaining in importance in the South for that 80-year time period. Whereas if we talk about New England and the Middle States, we see that it's becoming less and less important over time. What we end up seeing is that, particularly in New England, it becomes less and less important because there's emancipation laws that hit during this time period where basically they outlaw slavery, and slaves that are already in slavery, they gradually emancipated them. So they would have to reach a certain age. So if you were an 18-year-old slave in New England, you would eventually be set free at, let's say, the age of 25, and then you would be given your freedom. These were gradual emancipation schemes that occurred in the New England and the Middle colonies. So just realize the relative importance between the different regions, New England, the Middle states, and the Southern states of slavery. By far, slave agriculture was much more important in the Southern states compared to the other regions of the United States. And this is just illustrating this point that you can see that even from 1790, over 90% of the slaves in the United States were in the Southern colonies. I think it's like 92 to 94%. You can see in the middle, roughly about 5%, somewhere along those lines. And from 1790 on, that percentage declines in middle colonies till basically it's roughly zero for New England and for the middle colonies. So you can see that going up until 1860. By 1860, I believe the number was close to like 98 or 99% of all slaves in the United States were located in the South. So just realize that for the entire time period from 1790 to 1860, over 90% of the slaves that were in the United States were located in the Southern colonies. So once again, underpinning the notion of how important slavery was to the South relative to the middle colonies and to New England. Now, moving on, we're taking a look at the research of CONRAD and MEYER. And the reason why the research of CONRAD and MEYER is so important is because, number one, they use econometrics in their article. I think one of the first ones to use econometrics in taking a look at particularly slavery. What they do is they measure the returns to slave agriculture comparable to other investments. So they basically come up with, using econometric techniques and collecting data, come up with a rate of return on the investment in slavery in the South. And what they find is that the rate of return that they come up with is comparable or even higher than other investments that were available to plantation owners. So their argument is, where other people were saying, well, slavery was an institution that was dying. The plantation owners were losing money. It wasn't a good investment comparable to other institutions or other investment opportunities out there. CONRAD and MEYER flipped that over completely and say, no. Number one, it was comparable. The rates of return on slavery were comparable to other investments that were available to the plantation owner. And in some instances that their estimates come up that it was actually higher. So it made economic sense for the plantation owners to invest in the slave labor force. They also argue that the entire South benefited from the system. All right. Even the Old South versus the New South. And the Old South, I'm talking, for example, like Virginia, that region there, that the old states actually benefited because what they saw was a net export of slaves from the Old South to the New South. So even though the plantation agriculture system was slowly dying out in the Old South, and for any other reason, then their argument is that as the land became less productive, as it was becoming farmed more and more and it was becoming less productive, they were able to produce less, that those parts of the South still benefited because they saw income from the fact that they were selling existing slave labor to the newer regions of the South. And they also show that there's a very strong relationship by the level of cotton production and the amount of slaves that were in the South. And they also sort of show the whole migration where the Old South is where cotton plantations started. It migrated south down into North Carolina, South Carolina, and then it moved out west, going all the way out to Texas. And it seems that the slave labor force, they show that as cotton production regions shifted south and then west, the slave population shifted with it. So they show a very strong relationship between cotton production and the slave labor and the plantation system of the South. So that's something that's very important, that they show a very strong tie through econometric methods between the output of cotton and the input of slave labor, and they tie these two together very strongly in their research. CONRAD and MEYER also, so they established the fact that it's profitable and it's viable. So basically, the notion that slavery was dying, they undercut that argument completely with their analysis. They show that it was a viable institution, it was a profitable institution, and it was a viable investment when you compare it to other investment opportunities that are out there. They also show that any historical analysis of the slave system that introduces cultural and institutional forms to the analysis are largely irrelevant. That the most important thing to understand about the slave labor system was that it was profitable and it was a comparable system to other investments. If you could talking about culture and other types of institutional applications in the argument or the analysis of the viability of slavery, they argue is irrelevant because slavery continued to exist because it was profitable. If it had stopped being profitable, then it would have stopped existing. CONRAD and MEYER is the first piece of research that's done on the economics of slavery. And the next important piece of research that we talk about comes from FOGEL and ENGERMAN, particularly their book, Time on the Cross. I read this in graduate school. It's a tough read, I'll tell you that much, but there are portions of it that are very, very illuminating. There's a book of appendices that go with it too, and going through that, I can tell you, is quite a daunting task. I would say that if you were going to if you're going to look up things that you would want to read to further your knowledge, that the Gavin Wright book on the cotton economy is very good. With the FOGEL and ENGERMAN, Time on the Cross, I would also recommend that you get this book if you want to further your knowledge about the slave system and the economics of slavery. Just realize that it's the type of book I would never expect anybody to read the book in its entirety. I read it in its entirety in graduate school, and I thought it was quite a chore, portions of it. But there are chapters in there that are quite illuminating. So if you don't mind purchasing a book to read a few chapters out of it, you can learn quite a bit. It's one of the reasons why I don't actually assign it as part of the course. I find it difficult to assign a book and have people buy a book full well knowing that they might only get use out of 2 or 3 chapters in a book. So that's their book, Time on the Cross. They come up with 10 major ideas or notions about slavery and the economics of slavery. I want you to realize that few of these aren't that novel. For example, they basically, a portion of them, they just agree with what CONRAD and MEYER come up with. So they agree with CONRAD and MEYER on some of these things, some of their statements. But then they also make some assertions that, number one, given the evidence they give, some people criticize them that they overstretched their statements based upon the evidence that's available to them. So they got a lot of criticism for a couple of the assertions that they make, and that was the underpinning of the argument against them, is that they came to conclusions that that didn't have much basis in the data that they had before them. So like I said, some of the ideas weren't very novel. They just, reinforced some of the research of CONRAD and MEYER, but they had some additional findings that some people found radical. All right, so just a few of these. Slavery was economically rational and profitable. Not too much different from CONRAD and MEYER here. Neither is this. Prior to 1861, slavery was thriving and growing. All right, so these two theses are basically are the same as CONRAD and MEYER's. They just strengthen it or come to agreement with them. So they say it's profitable, and when they say rational, they're not talking morally or ethically rational. They're just saying that the institution itself was profitable, that as a rational and an economic sense for individuals who are attempting to maximize profit, that the system of slave labor was more profitable than other types of labor that were available to the plantation owners at the time period. So slavery was thriving. Their argument that it was thriving goes to that argument I said previously, where people said slavery was dying because the price of slaves was increasing prior to, or it was increasing for pretty much the entirety of the 1800s leading up until the Civil War. Well, their argument is the reason why the price was going up is because demand was going up. That slavery, and as the cotton industry developed and as industrialization was occurring in Europe and the textile industries, the cloth making industry in Great Britain was thriving and the demand for cotton was going up. When the demand for cotton was going up, the price of cotton's going up, which means that the inputs you used to cultivate and grow cotton also go up. So just realize that their argument is that yes, the price of slaves was going up, but that was because the demand for cotton was increasing because of the Industrial Revolution. And since slave labor was so closely tied to cotton production, as the demand for cotton went up, the demand for slaves goes up. And under a system where you could not import slaves anymore, you're only increase in slave population was through a natural increase, that the demand for slaves was increasing faster than the supply, which was driving the price up. They also make the argument that slaveholders were not pessimistic, that individuals in the South were very optimistic about the plantation system and its continued success moving forward prior to the Civil War. All right, they do a couple of different types of analysis that slave agriculture was actually more efficient than free agriculture. All right, so I want you to realize that yes, you can make this type of statement, but also realize that there is a fundamental difference when you compare a free population and a slave population. Yes, you can compare the labor from those two, but remember that there is a fundamental difference. The fact that free workers can go, they can leave. You know, there's an old song from I don't know if it was in the 80s by Eddie Rabbitt called, take this job and shove it, I ain't going to work here no more. Well, if you're a slave, you can't tell your your owner to take this job and shove it, you ain't working anymore. There would be terrible repercussions if you did that. If you're a free worker, you could tell your boss to stick it and go and work somewhere else. Quit your job and go try and find a job somewhere else. So realize that a portion of any efficiencies that are seen between free agriculture and slave agriculture is not that the workers themselves are that much more efficient. It's that the restrictions placed upon the slave's labor may induce higher levels of output just because of the institution itself. So also, that's the controversial statement that I talked about here, that slave laborers were more hardworking and efficient. That's the statement that was one of the more controversial ones. And like I said, the reason why that this is a controversial assertion is anytime you compare slave labor forces and free labor forces, you have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. The fact that you're comparing two institutions that fundamentally have differences, and saying that slave workers were more hardworking, well, to me, that's saying that they are better workers. Well, they might not be better workers. For example, if you took the slave laborers and allowed them to become free workers, would they be that much more efficient than their free counterparts if they were suddenly set free? Who knows? So I think the fact of forced work and any kind of physical punishments that were out there sort of undermine that argument, that the fact that the workers might not have been that much more efficient, but the incentives or the incentive not to be beaten, etc., played a large part in this. So that's where the argument for this was controversial. People said, well, you're not really making an appropriate comparison. The only way you can make this statement is if you took a look at slave laborers and then made them free and then compared them to the free individuals who were working out there, which did not occur. All right, they also assert that demand was increasing quickly in urban areas. All right, I think this wasn't too controversial, but to me it's not that big of a deal. I think this applied more to the Old South than to the New South. I think it was as new slave areas were opening up, particularly in Texas, the demand was increasing more quickly on farms than it was in the urban setting. But I think for the Old South that this very much could have held. Here are two of the more controversial aspects. Slave breeding was a myth. Now, the argument against this is that there is no data or no basis for them to say that it was a myth. It did not exist. To me, when you're saying slave breeding was a myth, you're saying slave breeding never existed. And part of their argument was that there's not much documentation of slave breeding occurring on plantations. Well, I can tell you one thing, that just because there's not documentation of an activity does not mean that activity does not exist, right? I can tell you right now that even though slavery was considered legal and appropriate in the South, the notion of slave breeding was considered taboo among the plantation owners. Even though it was perfectly legal for them to do that the notion that they would engage in this activity was not spoken. It's almost like that cousin or relative of yours that's, gets in trouble, gets arrested, or has problems. People don't discuss that particular cousin or that nephew or that brother or that sister. They just don't come up in conversation. So their notion that the lack of documentation about slave breeding means that it didn't occur. Well, under a system where that's considered taboo and it's not something that gets discussed, it could still exist in the background, just people just didn't discuss it. I find it hard to believe because also I don't know the scope of this, but to say that slave breeding did not exist seems to just doesn't make sense, particularly when FOGEL and ENGERMAN make the argument that plantation owners were economically rational individuals. Let's take this out of the context of a slave system. Remember, we're talking about a system where people were treated as if they were property and they were cattle and they were livestock. Let me ask you this. If you transform this argument, and we're not talking about people, but we're talking about cattle. Do cattle farmers engage in cattle breeding? Yes, they do. Do people who run pig farms, do they engage in pig breeding? Yes, they do. Why do they do this? Because it's economically viable, it's economically rational for them to engage in those activities. So if we move the argument away from the person level and into the livestock level, that if you have these types of farms where you're engaging in engaged livestock, you do have an element where there is slave, the breeding does actually occur. Also, they take a look at the exploitation rate. Okay, wait a minute, here's another argument that the material condition of slaves was equal to free whites employed in northern factories. Well, here's the argument. This is this comparison, again, I don't agree with this type of comparison because you're comparing individuals who are free. Remember, the argument that you can compare slaves and the condition of slaves to free individuals doesn't really hold, because slaves can't leave. Slaves can't tell their boss, no, I'm not doing that work and I don't want to do that work and I'm going to go somewhere else and work. So comparing the conditions of slaves to free workers employed in northern factories, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. Also, the comparison they make is also to the poorest. So they say, the slave's condition was very similar to the poorest of individuals who were employed in northern factories. All right? So you understand the objection to this. Once again, comparing slave population to a free population, how applicable is it to make that comparison? Also, the rate of exploitation they estimate to be about 10%. Basically, that's the amount of labor or the production of the slave workers that was expropriated by the slave owners. So basically, let's say if they were producing $100 worth of output, the slave owners were taking roughly 10% or $10 for every $100 of production they were producing. This was considered controversial because other estimates placed this as much higher. Some of them actually placed estimates closer to 50%. So this was controversial because people felt that they grossly underestimated the level of exploitation that occurred in the slave agriculture system. And also during the time period, a lot of people argued that the Southern economy was stagnant. When they took a look at the Southern economy prior to the Civil War, they find that it was a growing economy, contrary to what many historians talked about prior to the Civil War. Now, if we talk about productivity, what I want you to realize here is that much of the analysis of the plantation agriculture system that occurred during the time period, that the slave system exhibited economies of scale, meaning that the larger the scale of production of the plantations, the greater labor productivity was. And here's some data, and this comes from FOGEL and ENGERMAN. All right, the number 100 represents farm productivity on northern farms. So this 100 number is comparing to northern farms is the basis point for comparison. So let's take a look at the Old South. You can see that if you had a farm in the Old South, your production index was about 98. If you engaged from 1 to 15 slaves, your productivity was higher. So basically, about a 5% increase in labor productivity just from the fact that you had a small farm with no slaves to a small farm with 1 to 15 slaves. But what do you see once we start getting into farm sizes of 16 to 50? You see a dramatic increase in labor force productivity. In essence, we see about a 20% increase in labor productivity just due to the fact that the farm now has a much larger slave force. All right, and if we move to 51 or more, we can see that labor productivity actually increases to 135. All right, so in the Old South, we can see that the larger the size of the slave labor force on the plantation, the larger labor productivity is. And the same thing holds for the New South. So the Old South is the older parts like Virginia, etc. And the New South is the newer regions as plantations and the cotton production shifted south and further west. You can see that the same thing holds, that as you increase the plantation size in terms of the number of workers, we can see that labor productivity increases. We go from a farm that has no slaves to a farm that has 1 to 15 slaves. We can see that we get about a 10% increase in labor force productivity. But then what do we see in the New South when we go from a small farm, let's say, and I'll just say a small farm size is 1 to 15 slaves, to a large farm, 16 to 50 slaves? You see a dramatic increase in labor productivity, about a 30% increase per worker, just due to the fact that you have a larger slave labor force working on those plantations. So that's what oftentimes economists say when they talk about the slave labor system, that it exhibited economies of scale, meaning that the larger the farm in terms of slave workers, the higher individual labor productivity was for the slave laborers on that farm. So remember that notion, that number one, that the slave agriculture exhibited economies of scale. Two, that the distinction is that these economies of scale came into or kicked in after the plantation exceeded a size of 15 slave workers. All right, so you have small plantations that had 1 to 15, where large plantations had 15 or more slaves on them. That seems to be the break point when the economies of scale really started to kick in. And the reason for this is that there were two different systems that were utilized on these plantations. There was a gang system and there was a task system. A task system is where individual slaves are given a specific task to do. For example, clear that particular field, and you were to go out and do that. So each individual had assigned tasks with that. The benefits of the task system is that there's a high degree of managerial control under a task system. You can hold individual slaves accountable for the work that they do and that they don't do. If I'm responsible for example, taking 100 cords of wood and taking it from one spot to another, and it doesn't get done, the plantation owner knows who didn't do their job. The problem with the task system is that it's not as efficient as the gang system. So the task system has the benefit of a high degree of managerial control and accountability of individual workers. All right, but the shortcoming is when you compare it to the gang system, that it's less productive than the gang system. The gang system is where you get groups of individuals to do specific work. So for example, if you had to pick cotton, you would get about 50 people out into a field, and their responsibility is to pick cotton. The thing with the gang system is that it gets very much driven by the individual who has the highest level of productivity. So the person who is the fastest at picking cotton is setting the pace for everybody else, and if you can't keep up, then you are singled out because you haven't done the appropriate work. The gang system, doesn't have the same level of managerial control as the task system, but it's much more efficient. So realize the difference between those two systems. Task system, you are given a specific job to do. It has a high degree of managerial control, but it is not a very efficient system. It's not relatively as efficient as the gang system. A gang system, you have a large workforce that goes out in the area to do that. The benefits of it has greater efficiency relative to the task system, but it lacks elements of managerial control. Steckel, his research has to do with the quality of life of slaves, and his research has changed a lot of perceptions and has shown that, for example, the quality of life, some people asserted that the quality of life of slaves was similar to those of the poorest individuals in the North, and his research has very much changed those perceptions. All right, and the reason for this is that the prevailing thought looked at population growth rates between the slave population and the free population, and noticed that the population rates were increasing at roughly the same rate. So if population A is growing by 5% a year and population B is growing at 5% a year, therefore they should have similar qualities of life because their rate of population growth is the same. Well, there's an inherent issue with making that comparison. The inherent issue with that is that you're only looking at a portion of the picture. What Steckel did is he actually looked at, number one, birth weight and mortality. And he found that the birth weight of slaves was much smaller than that of free individuals. That the records he got from different plantations and from free births was that slave babies were born lighter than free babies. So that gives an indication of prenatal care that wasn't as good for the slaves as it was for free individuals. He also found that there was a 30 to 35% mortality rate for newborns. And when you take a look at prenatal deaths and postnatal deaths, about 50% of slave births on the plantations that he had records for ended in death. So a baby, every pregnancy, 50% of all pregnancies either terminated in a miscarriage or the baby dying within several weeks after birth. You take a look at that rate and compare that to the poorest individuals, you see the death rate among slave children was roughly twice that as free children. All right? So he sort of undermines the argument that, well, these populations had similar birth rates, growth rates, let's say 5%, whatever the rate was, so therefore the quality of life must be similar. But he shows that, number one, babies that were born were not as large, they weighed less. that the mortality rates were twice as high for slave children as they were for free children, giving an indication of poor prenatal care relative to the other population. All right, and his explanation for this is that pregnant women worked well into pregnancy. A slave's job is to produce output. So if you're pregnant and you're a slave, you're going to work much longer into your pregnancy than a free individual will work into a pregnancy. Also, that these women had to return to work earlier than free women had to. So they had to go to work after birth. All right, and these two contributed to the high mortality rates among slave children during the time period. So, and he also addresses the fact that the population growth rates were similar because basically with the higher mortality rates that women, slave women, were having children at a higher rate than free women. That there were twice as many pregnancies among slave women relative to free women, and that the mortality and stillbirths, miscarriages, and deaths in the early stages of life for these children was twice as high. So the reason why the growth rates between the slave population and the free population were similar wasn't because the quality of life was the same. Those population growth rates were similar to one another because, number one, slave women were getting pregnant twice as frequently as free women. It's just that twice as many of those children were dying either through miscarriage or through postnatal death just after birth. Also realize that when he took a look at the age of first conception, that slave mothers generally were 2 years younger than free women when they first got pregnant. So Steckel sort of blows this myth out that, well, because the increase in the slave population and the free population were similar, they had similar qualities of life. He shows that that's not the case. It was just due to the fact that fertility rates were twice as high among slave women, and the fact that infant mortality rates were twice as high is the reason why those two rates were similar. And also his research kind of points out that relates to that breeding issue. If you're talking about women getting pregnant 2 years earlier, slave women versus free women, and we're also talking about the fact that female women are getting pregnant twice as frequently as free women, those two are arguments for the existence of slave breeding, and that sort of undermines it. Now, it doesn't prove that slave breeding existed, but if you operate under the assumption that slave breeding did occur during this time period, the fact that slave women got pregnant twice as frequent as free women would be an indication of that, and also the fact that the earlier first conception dates would also lead you to believe that. Also, that one quote that Steckel has, and it comes from your book, he basically said that the condition of a 3-year-old slave in the South was similar to today of living in the slums of Lagos, Nigeria, or Bangladesh. All right, so that comparison does not paint a very pretty picture for the quality of life of young slave children on these plantations. ELKINS, his argument about the persistence of slavery is the fact that the slave system crushed individualism. Now, this is more of a sociological argument, but I'm still going to go over it briefly, that the notion of self-interest to make sure that you didn't stick out. You drew attention to yourself. In all likelihood, if you drew attention to yourself, you would end up getting some form of physical punishment. So the notion that this notion of dependence over self-interest became ingrained in the slaves and helped to underlie why slavery was persistent. There wasn't issues on the plantations in the South because this notion of individualism and no individualism or crushed individualism and a lack of self-interest allowed the persistence of slave labor system in the South. Some people use the term the Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is when individuals who are kidnapped actually start to empathize with their kidnappers. Some people when they actually get freed from their kidnappers, are upset with the fact that they've been freed, because the fact that their individualism has been destroyed by the fact that they're kidnapped, and they're not interested in self-interest. They identify with their kidnappers and are upset if anything bad happens to their kidnappers. It's referred to the Stockholm Syndrome. Similar things happened in Nazi concentration camps during World War II, that individuals, they became so reliant on the soldiers who were at the concentration camps for their survival that they identified themselves with the individuals who held their lives in their hands. So they would get upset, for example, if a guard passed away. It runs contrary to everything that we say, but these are psychological things that have been proven to happen to individuals who are being held captive against their will. Genovese, he talks about why in the Indies, all right, in that region, the West Indies, etc., that there was a high level of slave revolts, and why were there so few slave revolts in North America, all right? And he gives 4 distinct reasons why there were more slave revolts in the Caribbean versus North America. The ratio of slaves to non-slaves. In the Caribbean, the ratio of slaves to free individuals was much higher. All right, remember in South Carolina, the number was somewhere around 60% slave. These numbers were even higher than that, 70, 80, 90%, even higher on some of the islands on the Caribbean. So you have an enslaved labor force that in total is much greater than the free population that's enslaving them. So his argument is that as this ratio gets higher and higher, up to 90%, the likelihood of a slave revolt actually occurring increases. Also, the size of the slaveholding units. All right, most of the slaves that were held in the South were held on relatively smaller ones. The largest slaveholding units generally got to be about 120, while in the Caribbean these units got to be much higher, even up to 200. So when you couple the fact that you have so very few free individuals overseeing a vastly larger slave population, and that you end up with plantation units that have larger concentrations of slaves on them, both of these lead to the fact that the Caribbean would have had more slave revolts. Also, the Caribbean, their surroundings and the terrain led to more slave results. The reason it's a mountainous region with jungles, etc., that if you were to have a slave revolt and run off and try to get away from your captors, it's much easier for individuals to hide in the Caribbean versus in North America. So that increases the likelihood. And also, most of the slaves that were in North America were native-born slaves. They had lost any connection to Africa, whereas in the Caribbean, a larger ratio of those individuals were African-born. They were more likely to seed discontent among individuals and foment revolts among the population, because they had still some type of attachment to freedom, whereas the slaves that were in North America had been born into slavery and had very little notion of what freedom was. All right, so just remember that those are the major points. Also, this notion of slave breeding is important. There is no direct evidence, all right, but some of the indirect evidence that occurs, that some people argue, show that slave breeding did actually exist, that the slave sales from the Old South to the New South was quite large. So the argument is that slave breeding existed, and the likeliest scenario would be that the breeding occurred in the Old South and those slaves were shipped to the New South, which would make sense. So we see the sale of slaves from the Old South to New South was quite large. So as the plantation system and cotton migrated south and then into the west, the regions that were left behind became more dependent upon the breeding of slaves than the newer regions. Like I've said, there's no direct evidence of this, and we're just taking a look at indirect evidence that would be. This is sort of circumstantial evidence that this existed. When we take a look at the states that were net sellers, there was a greater ratio of children to adults in the selling states, which would give an indication that there was a higher production of children in those selling states. Once again, it doesn't prove that slave breeding existed, but as a condition, it is circumstantial evidence that slave breeding existed in the Old South. And also in the selling states, the ratio of children to adults was higher on plantations where um, where the ratio of men to women was lower, not older, so lower. So that gives an indication that you would think you'd have more children, the more men to women that you had, there was a better ratio. But it seems like in the selling states that the lower the ratio of men to women, the more children were being produced, which seems to be counterproductive.